Well, welcome everyone to this September HVG Coffee Afternoon on the 13th of September. I'm really delighted to be joined today by Tamsin Russell from the Museums Association and our colleague Will, who will be joining us very shortly. I won't endeavour to introduce them in full in case I get myself muddled with their role titles, so I will ask them to do it themselves in a moment. But today we're talking all about kind of front of house resourcing, I guess, so both the staff and the volunteer side of that and what is involved. I think it should be a really great session, so I really hope that you will get a lot out of the session. Pop any comments, questions in the chat, as we said, and we will get to them through the session, hopefully. So handing over to Tamsin, and maybe if you want to introduce yourself a little bit more fully, that would be fab. Thank you, Tamsin.
Wonderful. So many apologies, first of all, that you can't see me. My camera's broken. The challenges of technology. So my name's Tamsin Russell, and I'm delighted to be here speaking on behalf of my role at the Museums Association. What I am going to be talking about today and to share with you all is a publication that was launched at the end of March 2022. It was called the Front of House Charter for Change. I'm going to talk about how we got there and the content in much greater detail. But for those of you sitting here thinking, how does this relate to me? The key component around the Front of House Charter for Change was to give people that work in operational roles a voice. So that was one of our key aims. And what we know is that whilst there are lots of organisations and museums that do have paid staff, we also know that there's a high percentage of museums that are solely volunteer run. So when we're talking about operational roles, when we're talking about roles that might be thought of as those that have sort of direct contact with our visiting public, those front of house roles, we know that that is applicable to both paid staff and also volunteers. And that's why myself and Will wanted this opportunity to share this piece of research and recommendations with everybody here at HVG. So I've got a set of slides that will be able to be shared with the group afterwards. So don't feel the need to take lots and lots of notes. We'll share those shortly along with some other web links as well. So let me just get started. So hopefully everyone can see a bright sort of bluey purple screen. If then someone, Alex, can you put your thumbs up if you can see it? Oh, Rhiannon, brilliant. Thank you both. What a joy to have you both in the room. So this piece of work was published in March 2022. And as a function of this work, we did some research with individuals within the sector. And the research was focused on individuals that worked in operational roles. We got a really good response rate. We got 344 people respond to this piece of research, which is really high in terms of workforce research in the sector. So if you want to know more about Front of House Charter for Change, it's on our website, and I'll put the link in the chat very, very shortly. So it's a dedicated website page. It then also has individual content that you can choose to click to if there's something that's more important. So for example, if professional development was something that you wanted to focus on, if you're getting feedback from volunteers or others that work in the sector and volunteer in the sector, they want to know more about how do they become a more capable volunteer, how do they deliver to their audiences. You might choose just to go to a single section, or you might want to look at the whole charter in its entirety. For those of you that are trying to influence board members, we also have a 2-page PDF. So we appreciate that not everybody will like to access this document on a web page. So we do have a pre-prepared 2-page PDF that basically summarises everything that I'm going to be talking about, and really is there so you can waggle it in front of decision makers, chairs of boards, or those that are in more strategic decisions or positions, I should say. This was a collaboration between the Museums Association and the grassroots organisation Front of House in Museums. Some of you will be familiar with this group, I am sure. Certainly, I'm sure you're familiar with William Tregaskes, who has been part of HVG for a long time. So we worked with them to develop the research, develop the recommendations, and then to publish this particular report and research summary. So, first poll, Rhiannon, if you wouldn't mind, is have you heard of the Front of House Charter for Change? Now, do I need to stop sharing my slides to enable you to do a poll, Rhiannon? I don't think I've ever worked that out.
Well, typically, the same thing has happened to last time. I tried this just as I came in and it was working. Now it's not. Matt, could you try and press poll for me at the bottom?
Can everyone see that okay?
I can't see anything, but I think it's because I've got my slides sharing. Let me stop my slides.
Let me tell you why. It's because I need to press the button that says launch, so that would be good.
So, first poll of today, have you heard of Front of House Charter for Change? Yes or no? I can't complete it because I'm a co-host, but everyone else can.
Okay, so the results are trickling in.
Just another minute. I think we've probably got everybody, actually.
Yeah, some people are already stealing the march. Question number 2 has been answered as well. Can you see the questions, Tamsin, or do you want me to read them out?
I can see the questions, and what I'll do also is I will just take shall I end poll and then take a photograph? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I think I can do it as well. Sorry about that.
That's all right.
I'm going to share the results. Can everyone see those results? No one can see those results. 1 second. How strange. So 80% of people said they have heard of it. 10% of people said no, they haven't. And 10% of people are not sure. Oh, James, you can see them. Hello, lovely James. So 80, 10 and 10. So that's great. We're in the right place. Hopefully I'll be giving some more detail. I'm now going to share my screen again. And 1 second, everyone can see that hopefully. So what are we going to talk about before you get set off in your individual breakout rooms? So I'm going to quickly just talk through the research aim, methods and how we develop this, the testing. And then I'm going to spend some time looking at the individual parts of Front of House Charter for Change. And then we're going to go into breakout rooms. And we've got a number of questions that we'd like you in 2 small groups just to explore. And what I'm always conscious about is when you go into breakout rooms, often you literally get in and then the room closes and you don't get a chance either to introduce yourselves or actually to have a meaty conversation. So we have earmarked 20 minutes for breakout rooms. And for those of you that think I can't possibly talk or you can't possibly talk for 20 minutes, it's also your opportunity to go to the loo or maybe get yourself a glass of water. But essentially, it's a digital break from screens and discussion. And then we are going to find out what you've said. We're going to get some highlights of your breakout sessions and then maybe answer any questions that you might have. And then we'll all be finished in plenty of time for Rhiannon to close the coffee afternoon and move on. So another poll. Do you feel that front of house volunteers are treated better than front of house employees? So again, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Matt, could you launch a poll? I haven't got I have got a poll. Shall I see if I can launch it? Or actually, could you launch it, please?
Yeah.
Poll number 2.
Poll number 2, relaunch poll, continue. There we go. Have you heard of it? End poll. Share results. Stop sharing. Share results. I can't.
So there should be another poll.
People voted on that actually.
Yeah, they've already. Oh, okay.
So I'm going to relaunch it, but
okay.
People can, if people could revote on question number 2, that'd be fab. Okay. Sorry, I do see that. I couldn't see it very clearly because I hadn't scrolled down.
Apologies, guys. So I only ever saw the answer for the first one. Apologies, people. I didn't realise they were launched at the same time, so many apologies. So anyone else that wants to vote for question number 2? Wonderful. So we've got what we've got is some people sitting on the fence to say they're not sure that front of house volunteers are treated better or worse. So 11% say better, 22% say worse, and 67% say not sure. And I think that's a really important point, is just really getting a sense of how our employees and our volunteers feel. And often people's dissatisfaction may come from seeing themselves being treated differently from others. So if you are in that not sure part, then I would suggest that, you know, part of your conversations with your volunteers might be to get a sort of a litmus test, really, to see the extent to which they feel they are treated more positively and more constructively than others, or whether they do feel ultimately like a poor relative, you know, like the person at the bottom of the pile, as it were. So I'm just going to close the polls, if that's okay. We're not going to do any more polls until right at the end. So bear with me. Let me now go back to the screen. So you could also hopefully see my screen. We've just done poll 2, and I've got a capture of that, so thank you very much. So what were the project aims? So first of all, we really wanted to highlight that working in an operational role is a career in its own right. It's a specialism in its own right. What we had heard from front of house museums was that often there's a sense that anyone could deal with visitors. And as part of that, there was a sense that working in a front of house role was a less skilled role, was less, what's the word? Less able to be respected. So there was slightly lack of respect potentially within organisations. And what we want to do through this research is, first of all, say that this group of people is really important. They're important enough that we want to research their opinions. And then we also want to share what good practice looks like and share what poor practice looks like, so that we're moving in the right direction. We really wanted to make sure that the value and contribution of front of house colleagues, and that includes employees and volunteers, was esteemed and valued. So there are a number of research outputs, and I've already highlighted the specific charter, and we have that in English, and it's also been translated into Welsh. We have some individuals at the tops of organisations, so CEOs of a variety of other organisations in the sector, highlighting their support for the Charter and why it's important that all organisations pay attention to their front of house colleagues. The reason why I think that support for the Charter is so important is that often, again, when influencing within organisations, you can get greater interest with those at the top of the organisation if you then reference their peers and colleagues. So if I say something like, well, do you know what? I think this is really important, and my CEO might say, well, no, it's not. And I might say, well, Laura Pye thinks it's really important, or Tony Butler thinks it's really important, or Nat Edwards thinks it's really important. So really highlighting perhaps other people that they might esteem more, that thinks the front of house Charter for Change is important, and therefore they'll be more likely to then think about what that means for their own organisations. We also have, coming this way in September, a summary of the research. We've all got some how-tos. We've got a PowerPoint presentation, a whole raft of different resources. So if you are wanting to do a presentation in your own organisation about front of house Charter for Change, then there is scope for you to do that. And we've already written a presentation for you. Just let me know and I can send it to you. And what we really want in terms of outcomes is an increased understanding of the experience of front of house colleagues, a commitment to ensure wherever possible that there is equity for front of house colleagues. And that's not always going to be the case. Lots of front of house roles have to be delivered on site. So the opportunities for digital or remote volunteering just aren't there for those volunteers in operational roles. And then we also wanted to just essentially improve that experience so that we're not seeing higher leave rates. So that concept of leaving, that intention to leave. We put a questionnaire out. I'm not going to go through all of these bits. You'll get the slides afterwards. But as I've already said, we had essentially a 4-week research window, and we got high level of engagement, 344 responses to these 5 questions. In terms of what we did as a result of that is we looked at all of the content that those 344 people gave us, which was great. And we analysed it and came up with themes that were felt to be important in terms of the treatment of operational volunteers or operational staff. But we wanted to make sure that we tested those. So we tested that on something called Museum Hour. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Museum Hour. If you're not familiar, then really would recommend that you follow them if you're on Twitter. It's a really great opportunity for you to do some professional development with those other peers. And we had really good engagement. We had about 100 people there, and we did polls as well on Twitter, which is always a challenge, but asked people about whether they felt the themes were the right ones. We asked them also about their attraction to an organisation as an employer, or the intention to leave, and also whether they performed better. And we've summarised all of that. The output of this piece of engagement was that we went from 7 themes to 5 themes. And this is just an example of some of the polls that we did. So in terms of our themes, we renamed them at the publication point. So we now call them 5 principles of practice. And under each of those principles of practice, there are 8 recommendations. And those recommendations are positioned as, for example, and the reason that we did the for example recommendations is that we acknowledge that there is huge diversity in organisations. So imagine if I said you all need to do these 8 things. You know, if you're a really large organisation, or if you're a really small organisation, that may or may not be possible. So our terminology was for example. And we did lots of testing with lots of different people. So one of the first principles of practice was about well-being. So for all of the principles of practice, remember there are 5, we have a summary statement that basically defines what we mean by well-being. And then underneath that summary statement, we then have 8, for example, recommendations. And these are all the recommendations for well-being. Again, I'm not going to talk you through all of these, but there's something about levels of staff, and I use that word broadly, people having enough time to do tasks that they're allocated, that the resources are prioritised, that where they give feedback, perhaps to their museum's manager or their own volunteer coordinator, their feedback and concerns are taken seriously. Also, in terms of dealing with demanding situations, certainly as a function of returning to museums post-pandemic, you know, there were other aspects that volunteers or front of house colleagues had to deal with in terms of, for example, are you wearing a mask, social distancing, all those sort of things. So we wanted to make sure that front of house colleagues were really supported when dealing with demanding situations, and that risk assessments were carried out and their well-being specifically was prioritised. And that also incorporated having time and locations for rests and lunch breaks. We had lots of examples of people saying, do you know, there wasn't anywhere for me to go. So I'd have to go and sit in a cold car park or in my car, if I was lucky enough to have one, to have my lunch. So again, just really treated in a very different way. So well-being was the first principle of practice. The second principle of practice, which is less pertinent, I absolutely appreciate in terms of volunteering, but those conditions are also important. But the whole idea about how you're treated in terms of those conditions of work is important. How people are recognised in terms of the work that they do? You know, are they thanked? Are they valued? Is there a reward system? Is there a volunteer of the year award within your organisation? Do they get a letter when they've volunteered for an amount of time? There was a real sense that recognition wasn't as strong in front of house members of staff. Also, from a concept of inclusion, and I think this is probably a bigger question for all volunteers, is the extent to which museums actually pay attention to any of their views, especially when perhaps they're coming to a museum or a collections area that they've got industry experience in. So again, this whole idea was, are they invited along to celebrations? Are they invited along to sessions where there are presentations from managers, or are they kept at arm's length? Ultimately, are they sort of excluded and put in a little ring-fenced box? And then this whole idea of professional development, and we mean here really is about doing their role effectively. So professional development doesn't mean you only get it if you're a paid member of staff. Professional development is if you do stuff and need to develop to do your role as a volunteer. So why are we here, before I hand over to the lovely Will to get your views and your breakout rooms? We're here because if we looked at our respondent profile, so remember we got 344 people, only 7% of that group, so only 23 people were volunteers. So what we know is that the feedback we got in this piece of research is absolutely imbalanced. So we know that the research and the outputs come far more from employees' voices than volunteer voices. And that's what we'd like you to do now. So I'm now going to stop sharing my screen for an amount of time. I'm going to hand over to Will, who's going to brief the breakout sessions, and then Rhiannon, if you can put people in a breakout session, and we'll probably, because I know we've had some issues with the polls, probably be 15 minutes rather than 20. Is that okay? So I'm now going to stop sharing my screen. Will, oh, you're there. So if you just want to sort of brief again from your perspective as front of house museums co-founder, about what you'd like them to talk about as part of the breakout sessions, that'd be great.
Hi everyone, my name is Will Tregaskes. I am currently Arts Development Manager at Arts and Business Cymru, but during this project I was Museum Manager at Canterbury Museum Trust in South Wales, and I'm also a co-founder of Front of House and Museums, which is a group there to celebrate and advocate for all forms of front of house, voluntary, paid, operations, shop, anywhere within that front of house realm. And I think that today's discussion really is focusing on that volunteer element and how the volunteer experience is reflected in the charter and what feedback we can gather and understand different perspectives really. So I'm really keen in this next 15 minutes sort of look at a couple of questions. So the first one really is looking at how what in its current form, how relevant is it to the experience of front of house volunteers? Do any of the principles we've shared today, are they more relevant are any of the particular principles more relevant than others? Are there any other unique challenges which perhaps are not covered in the charter because of the percentage of research, and which particularly may affect front of house volunteers, so areas which might need further research or need to look into in a bit more depth to understand the unique experiences of front of house volunteers? And finally, is this charter helpful in its current form? How can we improve it? The importance of this document is that it's never gonna be can't be allowed to become stale, because the experience changes so regularly, just as we have seen over the last few years with a pandemic, for example. So we'd love to hear how it can be improved, and whether you find it useful going to your employers today and saying these are things we need to sort of look at, and these are the standards we need to support our volunteers with. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a really good 15 minutes of discussion. I guess if anyone who wants to sort of come in, sort of want to say their piece on the charter, please put your hands up and we can sort of start the conversation going. I'm really keen to hear from you on the different elements of of the Charter and your point of view. So if anyone's got a point to share, please raise your hands. And I should add, if there's anything that you do want to say but don't feel you want to say here today, Tamsin has her email address in the chat if you want to email her directly regarding it.
I'm trying to find the raise hand button, but I can't because I'm not used to Zoom.
Go for it.
So yeah, I think I was nominated after Pippa sort of led the discussion in our little group, and we thought it was really interesting, very useful, potentially helpful, and a good blueprint. But we did spend a bit of time sort of, going into, is there enough distinction between volunteers within front of house settings and paid staff? We talked about the terminology being quite important, especially to reassure front of house team members. We think it could be a really good advocacy opportunity so that volunteer front of house roles can be integrated within the whole sort of sphere of front of house operations. But yeah, there's a few things in, when you start referring to contracts and pay and stuff like that, there is potential for established front of house staff to get a little bit nervous.
Yeah, I can see your point. I think there's definitely some elements within there which do not relate to volunteering at all in that respect. Was there anything your group felt could be added to it which specifically relate to the volunteer experience?
I think someone mentioned a section specifically sort of looking at volunteering as well as within the whole. But I'll let if other people want to come in, I made some brief notes, but that's about it.
Thank you. Alex, did you have a point?
Yeah, I think in the discussion that we had in our group, we noticed that there was just a very big difference from the museums and heritage sites that would basically just not work or not be able to function without volunteers, and other services like ourselves, which we actually utilise volunteers as enrichment of activities. We do boost up our front of house team with extra volunteers, but the service still runs without them. So I think that's quite a big thing, just for us all to be aware that there are quite big differences. Whereas I think sometimes a volunteer in maybe a smaller heritage site would be taking on the role of a paid member staff, as in it would not be able to operate without that. So I think it clarified things to me quite clearly about how there's not one size fits all, for the approach.
Definitely, I think that's one of the things when we were developing the charter. In terms like that front of house experience, there's such a range of roles within that, within the museum sector, within front of house, from the nationals down to the smallest museums. It's very hard to negotiate the language. And I think one of the benefits of having those sort of suggestions, those sort of examples, helped sort of say that this is not the only way. This just sort of sets like a framework. But I think it's a really interesting point that also has to apply to volunteering as well, in terms of how each organization's volunteer structure differs. Anne, did you want to come in?
Apologies, on the iPad laid down here at the side of my laptop because we can't use Zoom again. But yeah, I don't obviously time for the other group to come in. But yeah, that was because I don't want to appear negative, because I think it's great. A front of house charter is something I kind of looked at, when we were talking about staff and things like that. But for me, in that situation as well, that we clearly, have this distinction between, staff and volunteers. And from that point of view, it sat a wee bit uneasy with myself. Like, it made me think, like, almost do you need this? Should it not, in a sense, come into all our policies and strategies about the way we respect and treat volunteers? And so we should cover it within those elements. And, if the front of it, but then I do understand the aspect that there's smaller organisations that will have, that do rely on this kind of coexistence of volunteers, but it just does, it sits a wee bit uneasy with me, if you like, because of, you know, mixing this and then using the word contract. You know, we spend a lot of time trying to be careful not to, you know, about terminology and about that, and it often makes me think, you know, well, wait a minute, then would you would in a sense then need a charter for every kind of tight role, if you like. Another, you'd need, however you band your volunteers together. So this is for front of house, you know, if it was, so I don't know, but I don't want to, you know, I can see the merits in it, but it just concerns me a little.
Yes, I can definitely understand. I know from experience in terms of not calling being a contract is a really difficult sort. Is you have to have the right terminology. And it's a really interesting point. Thank you, Anne. I think front of house charter came from a very specific position and experiences of front of house workers. So no, it's really interesting to hear your point of view on that volunteer element and how it fits in and how it doesn't fit in. So Tamsin, did you want to add to that point?
Yeah, I really just wanted to agree with Anne. You know, ultimately, I think everything that is in that document should be applicable to every human that is in a workplace, whether they are front of house, whether they're a volunteer, whether they're the CEO. I think, you know, there's nothing in there other than, you know, the contracts and concept of pay, but the whole idea about the treatment should be applicable to everybody. And we did have a lot of discussion about the extent to which, is this about front of house charter for front of house staff only, or is this more applicable more widely to just human beings? And the reason why we kept it as this, apart from that was the original idea, is that the sense we got from the people that completed the questionnaire was that their experience of work, their negative experience of work, was more palpable. It was felt more strongly. It was amplified as a function of often front of house staff having less power within an organisation, and also then really poor pay, which I know isn't applicable to volunteers. So that actually their experience of work was just more heartfelt because of those two other factors that were meaning that it was just more palpable. So I agree, everything in here should be, we treat all human beings well. But this, a particular case in point is well sort of highlighted.
Thank you, Tamsin. I think it's a really important discussion. It also highlights how many of the factors of the charter do relate to the volunteer experience. So, for example, having appropriate spaces to sort of rest in, or appropriate equipment provided. A lot of those basic fundamentals are universal to any role within museums, voluntary or not. Pippa, did you want to come in?
Yes, no, it was just feeding on what Tom and Anne were saying in terms of like being able to create a differentiation between volunteers and staff within the charter. And I think Anne and I were talking about it in terms of like the challenges we've had in terms of like selling volunteering within the front of house team that might feel that they sometimes can't talk about their honest feelings about having volunteers also join in with them. So with the opportunity of having like over 90% of front of house staff team responding to this, it could be just a section whereby front of house team acknowledge the valuable role that volunteers play within it, or even visualize or be able to honestly share their opinions about having volunteers within the sector, because it's a constant battle that we've been having for the last 10, 20 odd years. And, you know, it might be unfair to just put them all in one same pool when we don't even know if that separation is no longer there. I still think that there is that sense of separation and sometimes even threat from the staff members against volunteers.
Definitely, I think it can from like anecdotal experience within the sector. It's definitely a concern, particularly in those organisations where, and historically, the organisation has not relied on volunteers to open to the public, and that negotiation between the voluntary side and the staff side is a really interesting, but also you can understand from someone whose its livelihood, it's definitely a concern. But I think sort of understanding that relationship and clearing is definitely something which has to be sort of carefully discussed and sort of with bringing different voices in. So yeah, no, it's a really interesting point. Is that something people think should be sort of highlighted within the channel in terms of that relationship with volunteers, or is that something outside of that, looking at something a bit more different, focusing on volunteers, perhaps, for example?
I feel there is an opportunity there in getting staff members to like really be advocates for volunteers within the charter itself, because we might have volunteer policies that talk about the wonderfulness of volunteers and also the relationship with staff, but I don't think that there is any example of the other way around of staff and their relationship with volunteers. So maybe the charter would be a good place to start.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. I think that's a really interesting thing, sort of talking about the experience from the staff point of view, building relationships with volunteers, but also understanding that sort of like ongoing dialogue which will exist throughout, because you'll go to like many heritage and cultural organizations and you'll see staff and volunteers interacting as part of their organization. It's a really dynamic interface, and people will develop really good relationships. So just as volunteer managers do with their volunteers, it's that sort of relationship between them which develops, but also understanding how we move forward and making sure staff don't feel threatened, but also volunteers are supported to thrive in that environment. So I think we're coming to the end. So I'm going to, unless there's any final points, I will hand back over to Tamsin. But thank you for that discussion. It's been really, really interesting. I've been really thoughtful responses. So thank you. I'm really interested to see how this can move forward.
Thanks very much. I'm conscious of time, so I've put lots of different things in the chat function. So if you've got an opportunity to save that chat function, I've got sort of next steps and email addresses and the links to everything. So I'm just going to hand over to Rhiannon to close. But thank you for your reflections, and I've got lots of notes.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Tamsin and Will. It was a brilliant session. I think this could ricochet off into several more conversations yet. So watch this space. So we're literally going to round up. We've got some future dates for you. So we will be meeting again for next month's coffee afternoon on the 11th of October. And the 11th of October, we're going to focus on the topic of the moment, cost of living crisis, expenses, and what we can do to support our workforces during this time. So I think that should be a really meaty topic. So I hope you'll come along to that one. In November, we won't have a coffee afternoon because we have instead the conference. Matt, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, thanks, Rhiannon. Yes, I'm delighted to announce hot off the press today that ticketing for the conference will be going live very, very shortly. And this year's conference is called One Profession, Many Skills, not to be confused with the Assassins Conference, which is running at a similar time, which is One Profession, Many Kills. But we... Sorry, that was an awful joke. But we're really looking forward to it. The event will be opened by Sean Delaney, who is head of volunteering strategy at DCMS. And then we will also have a mixture of workshops and panel discussions over the 2 days as well. And we'll also conclude, or it will involve our annual Volunteer Leader of the Year award, which again will be going out very, very soon. So please keep your eyes peeled to your emails. There'll be something coming out very, very soon. It'll then, members will get special access to cheaper tickets. So we've kept the ticket costs down again this year in recognition of the cost of living crisis. You'll have early bird access to the £20 tickets, and then they'll go on general sale after that. So this will be something with you very soon.
Perfect, thank you, Matt. And then the last coffee afternoon of the year is going to be the 13th of December, and we're going to have a light-hearted one to finish off the year and hopefully a quiz. So I hope you'll join us for all 3 of those dates. Coming up literally immediately after this session is going to be our EDI drop-in, which lovely Tamsin's going to run again. So I'm going to drop the Zoom login details into the chat. So if you haven't managed to get those already and you fancy coming along on a wing and a prayer, please do join us. That will immediately follow this session. But otherwise, a huge thank you for coming today, and we look forward to seeing you next month, 11th of October. Take care, everyone.